Hi there, folks. Welcome to Nervous System Day 1. We're going to be seeing some things on this page that we won't be looking at until Day 2, so let's focus on the Day 1 stuff. We're going to begin with anatomy of a neuron, and for that we have two models. We've got this guy, and this one that's hiding behind our document. We'll use both of these. I'll hide that one for a moment, and we'll bring this back over here. Forgive the scratchy sounds. So, things we need to find on a neuron, typical nervous system cell that does all the nerve firing. We have external structures, cell body, dendrites, presynaptic terminals, axon hillock, axon Schwann cells. And in the Schwann cells, we'll learn that they're full of myelin and they join each other to node of Ranvier. And the other model that's hidden behind here right now will show us some endoneurium. So those are our goals as we look at the two models I just showed you. As we look at this one, here this big sort of round-ish area is the cell body. And as we take a look at that, we can see we have several places where information is coming in. That and that and that are all dendrites. Now, they're getting information from other cells around the brain by structures like this and this and this. These are presynaptic terminals, item number 3 there. The cell body has got this funnel-shaped area that is properly called an axon hillock. That's where the axon proper begins. So this is an axon. The axon for many cells are covered by these fat-filled cells called Schwann cells. Now, since I see Schwann cells here, I know I'm not inside the brain. I'm somewhere outside in the body proper, like maybe on an arm or something. These are Schwann cells. And here's a Schwann cell, here's another one. And the junction between them, we can see right there, that is item C here under 6 under Schwann cells, nodes of Ranvier. So I've shown you Schwann cells, I've showed you nodes of Ranvier. What I didn't show you is myelin. If we kind of lift the lid on this, we can see that these Schwann cells are effectively wrapped around that blue axon, sort of like wrapping a pancake around a sausage. And the stuff filling this here, the orange-looking stuff, is effectively fat. It's a specialized kind of fat known as myelin. So that is kind of what I need you to learn from a neuron, with the exception of one thing, which we'll see on the other model, is cell body, dendrites. Dendrites are here, here, here. There's another one over here. We can see that. Those are being talked to by other neurons with these presynaptic terminals. That would be item number 3 there. Presynaptic terminal, they kind of wiggle on here. Then we have the axon hillock, the axon proper, which is covered up by Schwann cells. We have a node of Ranvier where Schwann cell number 1 joins Schwann cell number 2. Don't worry about the numbering on that. That's not a real thing. Now let's get this model out of the way. I'll try to drag a little bit less. We'll reach through our image and pull right on through. And on this model, we can kind of see pretty much the same stuff we saw before. We have a cell body. We have dendrites all over this thing. I like this one for presynaptic terminals. That went sideways on me. Come back over here. For presynaptic terminals, I like this one because they're kind of this orangey color. They're very clearly distinct. Over here on this one, the presynaptic terminals are kind of just blue. So again, main things you need to know as we look at this model would be cell body, which is sometimes called a soma. Dendrites, they're all over this thing. Presynaptic terminals. And then we have the funnel-shaped axon hillock, which is where the axon leaves. Now, this model is a little interesting because it's got a to be continued section. This axon continues up here. This would be a Schwann cell. I'm pinching where one Schwann cell joins another, so that would be a node of Ranvier. And the thing that we did not see over on that model is this stuff. This is connective tissue wrapping around an axon, sort of like a sweater sleeve, and that is item number 7 here, endoneurium. So I think we have kind of, between this model and this one, learned all of the neuron stuff we need. cell bodies, dendrites, axon hillock, axons, Schwann cells, nodes of Ranvier, and if you pop that open, here you can see the filling, which is myelin, and you can see some myelin on the inside of there as well. So that should take care of anatomy of a neuron. So next we need to move into central nervous system. Let me grab our page and move it a little sideways. We're moving down to this set of models. And let's set this right here. And we'll do a little scrolling. So we're next going to learn about, stop selecting that. We're next going to learn about the brain. And as we take a look at the brain, we have, first off, brain. Oh, that is too close. Let me move our document sort of out of the way. It's a little too close for my taste. In fact, I'll bring it right here and sort of set it on the table and scroll down. I think that'll work. That's kind of nice. This is a brain. This is a brain. This big old clown color brain. We'll do lots of stuff with each of these. I might actually grab that note and move it, let's say right here. That'll work. A little closer. So for brain, one place I want to start is gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is sometimes called the cortex. White matter is sometimes called the medulla. Think cortex is sort of the outer layer and medulla is the middle. And this brain, kind of weirdly colored, does a great job of showing that. What I would like you to think of as you think of gray matter and white matter, or cortex and medulla, is I want you to think of a fresh orange. And I want you to think of the orange skin that you would peel away to get down to the fruit. That's going to be very much like the gray matter. Now, the thing I want to talk about is, if we go back over very briefly to our neurons, and I remind you that these are filled with this stuff called myelin. Well, myelin is fat. And what I'd like you to think of as you think of myelin, which is the fatty part of an axon, is think of bacon. And when you think of bacon, which is basically two main colors, when you're looking at typical uncooked bacon that you buy in the grocery store, you see several layers. There's the meaty part, the fatty part, the meaty part, the fatty part, the meaty part, and maybe another fatty part. What color is the fat? The fat is white. So when you see white matter in the brain, you are literally looking at fat. So what part of those axons over there was fat? That was the myelin. And you'll learn later in the lecture that those myelinated axons are there to speed things up. So when we look at our brain, and this is a great model to do this with, what we're going to look at is how thick is the cortex compared to how thick is the white matter. The cortex, the gray matter, is basically the sort of the thinking part of the brain, whereas the white matter, the medulla, is axons and myelin. It's the speedy part of the brain. So this one actually has a lift-off lid. And as I do that, turn and look. And I want you looking kind of right here. Now, okay, forgive me, this is green, not gray, but that's okay. You can see it. And this is the white matter. So weirdly, it's kind of like the skin of an orange. The skin of an orange is fairly thin. The fruity part is fairly thick. The skin of the orange is like the cortex or gray matter of the brain. And then down below there, we see all the white stuff. That is effectively axons moving things around very, very fast. We'll revisit this model for something else a bit later on. We then need to take a look at cerebrum. You know what? Actually, we're not quite done. We have under brain, we still have item 3 and 4 to take a look at, gyrus and sulcus. And that really kind of touches on one thing that's very, very prominent anytime you look at a brain model, frankly, it looks wrinkly. And what I want you to know is that the hills and the valleys have a unique name for each hill and each valley. Not each and every one, but the hills in general have got a name, and so do the valleys. The gyrus is sort of the hill of the brain, and the sulcus is the valley. And this model does a really great job of showing one particular valley, and that is this one right here. You see the green, and the tan here? There's a valley between those. That is the central sulcus. And then there's a gyrus on either side of that. There's one in front, there's one in back. By the way, this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. We'll get to lobes in a minute. We have frontal lobe, temporal lobe. We'll get to all those in a minute. I will give one of those away. This is the frontal lobe. Oh, I'll give two of those away. This is the parietal lobe. So I already talked about the central sulcus. This is the precentral gyrus, and this is the postcentral gyrus. They're on our list. We'll get to them in a minute, but trust me, they're on our list. Let's also take a look at, because we already, from this model, did cerebral cortex and cerebral medulla. We got that kind of covered. Let's look at the lobes of the cerebrum. And what we want to find are frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and insula. It can be known as the insula of Real. Frankly, I don't care about the insula of Real part, but I do want you to know the insula. So as we look at this brain, this is a great one. It's kind of color-coded, so it kind of stands out. So as we take a look at this up in front in tan is the frontal lobe. Behind that, we have a parietal lobe. Yes, you're actually remembering things from the skull when you studied skeleton. We had a frontal bone and parietal bones. We have a frontal lobe of the brain and parietal lobe of the brain. We also have down here this little, by the way, this often is described as looking like a mitten or a boxing glove, and this little guy down here looks like a thumb. That little thumb-looking guy, that would be the temporal lobe. And then we also have the occipital lobe in the very, very back. On this brain, it happens to be blue. That is the occipital lobe, and it primarily deals with vision. So we've covered frontal lobe right here. We've covered temporal lobe down here. We've covered parietal lobe right here. We've covered occipital lobe back here. What we haven't covered is insula. And you can see insula on one model, and we've already played with this one before. It's the one I like to call the pop-top brain. It's where I showed you cortex and medulla. When I lift that off like that, this is the insula. If you care to think of the real part, that's fine. That's the insula of Real. But if you look at this, this is also really showing very, very cleanly the cortex, or gray matter, versus the white matter. So nice little tip off on that. This model, let's get this one out of the way for a minute. This model is sometimes casually called the clown brain, sort of party color, and it shows all those same things we just looked at as well. This is a frontal lobe. Back here we see the parietal lobe. There's that central sulcus. There's that precentral gyrus. There's that postcentral gyrus. Turn this thing around, and we can sort of see the same things, but they have more areas labeled. You'll learn about some of these specific spots in lecture, and that's perfectly fine. Let's next take a look at the basal nuclei. Now, basal nuclei are a little interesting. We have to go to this brainstem model. This brainstem model shows us several things, and we'll focus on several things, but it shows us, I'm going to take this off. By the way, this is the insula, and if we get this out of the way, that's part of the ventricles, which we'll get to in a minute. If we take that insula, which we saw on this model, right there, and kind of lift it away, and this model will let me do that, we see this red thing underneath that. And that, my friends, is the basal ganglia. And for basal ganglia, there are two things I want you to know there: the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. The caudate nucleus looks like a big old tadpole on here. It's got a big swollen head, got kind of a tail that ends in a little bump there. And then the middle part of that looks to some old 18th century anatomist eye almost like a lentil, like a little bean. So that is the lentiform nucleus. So for basal nuclei, I want you to know that this whole red thing here is basal nuclei. That big curvy C-shaped thing there's the caudate nucleus. In fact, that's not a bad way to keep that in mind. The capital letter C looking guy there is the caudate nucleus. And in the middle of that, we have the lentiform nucleus. There are other parts on that I'm not going to hold you responsible for. Now, we did see way up here under brain, gray matter, white matter, gyrus, sulcus, we saw fissures, and I said see item 5 below. Let's go see item 5 below. Major fissures of the cerebrum. Let's put this guy back together for just a second. In fact, I'd prefer that you put that back together anytime you took one apart. So as we take a look at this, where we're holding a brain with the front of it going forward and the back of it facing us, you've heard the word hemispheres. We have a right and a left hemisphere, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. When it's together, there's this big split down the middle. And that big split down the middle is that great longitudinal fissure. Now, we also learned earlier about what was that one again? Back up here. We found the temporal lobe. And I said if you think of this as a mitten or a boxing glove, it looks like the thumb on the mitten or the thumb on the boxing glove. Right there is the lateral fissure. So there's the lateral fissure. Now, I already told you we needed to find, in fact, I named several of these. If we take a look at this, we had that central sulcus, and then we had the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, pre and post. We also have a cingulate gyrus, and the clown brain is your friend. So let me take this guy apart. You need to be careful taking this guy apart because one half is sort of solid and the other half is like a jigsaw puzzle. We don't want to do that. So the other major gyri that we didn't find, by the way, gyrus is one, gyri is multiple. So gyrus is singular, gyri is plural. We found the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus. On this model, we have precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, central sulcus between them. Turn it this way, and the big orange guy right here, that is the cingulate gyrus. We already did central sulcus. We found that already. There are a couple of other sulci below that. I'm not going to worry with that. Yet again, sulcus is singular, sulci is plural. Not a big deal. We're going to scroll up, and the next thing we need to find are thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland, corpora quadrigemina, midbrain, pons, cerebellum. We got more stuff to find. So let's go find it. On this model, this little football shape right here, that would be the thalamus. And down below here, in kind of a V, we have the hypothalamus. And it even tells you what it does in there. Sexual urges, motivational states, crazy stuff. So on this model, probably this one is better, there is, again, kind of a football shape right there. That is the thalamus. And in the middle of it, you see almost like a little eye peeking out at you. That is an interthalamic adhesion. We'll get to that a little bit later on. Below here, we have this little V shape, that little kind of V shape sticking down. That is a hypothalamus, sort of between my thumbs right there. What else do we have in that area? Ooh, infundibulum of pituitary. Let's take a look at this model for that. I like this one. In fact, I want this side of this model. There's our thalamus, right there. Looks like a football or kind of like an egg. And again, we have this little eye looking at us. That's the interthalamic adhesion. But see the little dangly part right there? The little dangly part is a pituitary gland, and it's dangling from a white stalk. That white stalk is this infundibulum of pituitary. It sort of dangles down from the hypothalamus. And I like the detail on this model because it shows me that if I look at this hypothalamus, which I've been kind of casually referring to as sort of V-shape, you can see the reality here. It's actually more like the beak of a bird. Top beak, bottom beak, top beak over here, bottom beak down here. That's the hypothalamus right there. Now, we also need to find the pineal gland, we found the pituitary, which is right there. That is on your list to know. If you look at the thalamus and go behind, see the little pink line and it ends in a little pink dot there? That's the pituitary gland. If we look on this model, we can see a pituitary back here, but it's not really differently colored, but it is this bulge back here. This model, we can see it, but it's not really colored very well. Forgive me, I'm going to make you dizzy. I'm going to walk a little bit. I want to go find a half-head model. We will leave our notes right here and come back to them. And I want to go get one of those half-head models. So forgive me while I stand. I try not to move too much and make you guys dizzy. But this model right here, this one does a great job of showing you the pituitary gland. Coming back up here. We need us a pituitary, sorry, not pituitary, I went crazy there, a pineal gland. We need a pineal gland. This one is kind of this cranberry color, and it is really easy to spot. Also, we can see that egg-shaped or oval-shaped or football-shaped thalamus. Behind that, we see the pituitary really clearly. So half-head, thank you for that. We also need to find an interesting little set of 4 bumps called corpora quadragemina. Now, for those of you who live here around the Temple, Texas area, you might know of a sort of a escape down to the beach in Texas, where you might go to Corpus Christi. Think about what the name of that city means. Corpus Christi means literally the body of Christ. So corpora is body. And quad, okay, what does quad mean? Some of you might have even ridden a quad bike before. So, didn't mean to move that, sorry. Quadragemina. Corpus quadragemina, 4 bodies, 4 bumps, really is what we're talking about here. And if we look at the back of the brainstem, we can see those. We see 1, 2, 1, 2. Those are the corpora quadragemina, and the top ones are superior colliculi, and yet again, when it ends in I, that's plural. If you want it to be singular, have it end in us. So superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. And if we have the right and the left together, those are colliculi. So above my thumbs, you see the superior colliculi. And when I move my thumbs out of the way, you can see the inferior colliculi. Now, on this model, even better, they're bigger. But the left side has been dissected away. You only see the right side. So that would be a superior colliculus, and that would be an inferior colliculus. Superior and inferior colliculi. Let's move that out of the way and see where we're going. Midbrain, quite frankly, I'm not going to do a ton with that. I will simply say it's sort of this area right here. And I'm not going to frankly probably ask you a question about that. In fact, if you want to in your mind, you can mark that through in red. Pons. As we take, don't go away from me. As we take a look at this whole area, this particular model is sometimes casually called the brainstem model. And this long handle that I'm holding is the medulla, or medulla oblongata. And above that, we see this, it almost looks like a cummerbund. If you've ever been in a wedding, a lot of times the groom wears this big, wide, fancy, ruffly belt. That's the cummerbund. That's the pons. So there's the pons, which is just below the midbrain area. And then the next thing we get to is commissures of the brain. I've already talked several times about the interthalamic adhesion. Every time we saw a thalamus, I told you about the interthalamic adhesion. So let's take a look at this one. This one might be, yeah, this stands out a little bit better. That little football shape or egg-shaped is the thalamus, and the little eyeball sticking out in the middle of that is the interthalamic adhesion. Now, since I've got this brain still in my hand, I want to talk about the other one. That's the corpus callosum. It is this big C shape right here. This is actually a belt of axons going from right to left in the brain. So the right side of the brain knows what the left side of the brain is up to, and that is the corpus callosum. We can see that also on this model. There's the corpus callosum. We see this very, very well on the clown brain. We already talked about the cingulate gyrus. Below that in white is the corpus callosum. Now, I left several other commissures out that I'm not going to make you deal with. This spinal cord stuff we'll deal with on day 2, so I'm not going to worry with that right now. We next need to move on to the last major topic of the day, and that is ventricles of the brain. I'm going to get a lot of these models out of our way. We'll get these out of our way. This one I'm going to sort of reassemble and keep for a moment, because we did look, oh, by the way, do you remember? That is basal nuclei. I want to put that back together, and I want to put back on something that I sort of casually, quickly took off. And that was this. That was just kind of hanging on there, and it's actually sort of broken, so I'm not going to worry about that. This is part of the ventricular system in the brain, sort of a hollow space filling your brain, and those ventricles can be really best represented by this model here. When you look at the ventricles of the brain, you see that we see lateral ventricles, plural, and then third ventricle, and then fourth ventricle, and there's a little duct connecting that one to that one. Why do we say third ventricle, but we say lateral ventricles? There are 2 lateral ventricles. We do not call them the left and the right, or the first and the second. But as we take a look at this model, looks for all the world like something out of a bad sci-fi movie, almost like a spaceship. These big C shapes, which we had still attached here, this is one of them from sort of the left side. We're not going to call it left because that's not part of its name, but that is a lateral ventricle. So as we take a look at this is a lateral ventricle. All this stuff I'm touching here. This one on this side, also a lateral ventricle. And then we get to third ventricle. And as we look at the third ventricle, stop that. I'm going to tell you, stop moving around on me. I'm going to tell you a fun trick on third ventricle. If we look at this actually sets in, you come here. We're looking this way, let's look this way. This actually sets by the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And I pointed out to you that the hypothalamus was sort of like a bird head, and we had a bottom beak and a top beak. So that's the thalamus. That's the hypothalamus. Remember the eye on the hypothalamus? Let's go back to the third ventricle. And we can see top beak, bottom beak, and eye. I often describe that third ventricle as looking like the head of a bird. Now, can you see that? There's the eye, there's the top beak, there's the bottom beak. That eye is where that interthalamic adhesion that we saw before goes. And that bottom beak, top beak and bottom beak are basically where the hypothalamus sits. So this sort of fills that area of the hypothalamus, and between the right and the left thalamus. Now, down here hanging off the bottom of this, sort of kite-shaped, is the fourth ventricle. And connecting the two is this little pipe-like structure that is called the cerebral aqueduct. So back over here on the notes, we have lateral ventricles, which we can see here. We have third ventricle, which I'm going to say a sentence. Once I say the sentence, you will never forget it, and you will never be able to see it. I've talked about this looking like a bird's head with a top beak, bottom beak, and eyeball head. You can see all that. And when I say this, you will have this locked in tight. The bird is the third. So that bird head is the third ventricle. This little pipe coming down to the fourth ventricle, that is the cerebral aqueduct. So cerebral aqueduct, and then down here is the fourth ventricle, and that takes care of the ventricles of the brain. So there is a right and left lateral ventricle, a third ventricle, a cerebral aqueduct, and a fourth ventricle. And that is all we need. Now, I'm not going to worry really about the blood supply to the brain. That's kind of AMP2 stuff, so you can literally just mark that all off in red. I haven't done that, but I'll do that before I drop this in Teams. And that is kind of what we need to learn for the first day of the nervous system. We did anatomy of a neuron. We did brain, gray matter, white matter, gyrus, sulcus, fissures. We did cerebrum. We did major features of the cerebrum. We did gyri and sulci, hypothalamus, corpus quadratum. Oh, we didn't do cerebellum. I'm going crazy. I totally and completely missed cerebellum. We did pons. We need to do cerebellum right now. This model, really, really good for cerebellum. As we take a look at the cerebellum, that is this little brown dude back here. So this is the cerebellum, and the thing to notice as you look at cerebellum is the word cerebellum. Let's scroll back up here again and look at cerebrum. All of this big wrinkly part, that is cerebrum. Take a look at the word cerebrum, where we found frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and insula, and compare the word cerebrum to the word cerebellum. The cerebellum is clearly the longer word, but it is the smaller structure. Cerebrum is the shorter word, but the bigger structure. The feature that I wanted you to find in the cerebellum is the arbor vitae, which literally means the tree of life. If you take this apart, you can see that. This white matter spreads out like kind of like a bush. That is the arbor vitae. This one actually shows it even whiter. So you need to know the arbor vitae. You need to know the cerebellum. And on this model, it is kind of a brown color cerebellum. On this model, it's kind of yellow color. And on this model, it is a really dark green color, but you can still see the tree shape in there. That is the arbor vitae. So sorry for kind of going a little bit sideways and missing out on cerebellum, but I got you covered now. Let's just double check and make sure we didn't miss anything. Anatomy of a neuron, we got all that stuff. Central nervous system, brain, we got gray matter, white matter, we got gyrus, sulcus, fissures. We discussed them farther down. Cerebrum, we discussed cerebral cortex and medulla. That would be the white part and the gray part. Actually, the gray part and then the white part. We also discussed all the lobes. We discussed the basal nuclei, which was that red dude in this model right here. We looked at the great longitudinal fissure and the lateral fissure. We looked at the central sulcus and then the pre- and post-central gyrus. We looked at the cingulate gyrus, which was the big orange thing on the inside of the brain. We saw thalamus on all the brain models. We saw hypothalamus on all the brain models. We saw the pineal on several, including this half head right here. We briefly took a look at the midbrain, which is basically between my hands right here. And we looked at the pons, which looks like a cummerbund on a tuxedo. We did the cerebellum late, but we did it. We looked at the medulla oblongata. On this model, it's basically from the pons on down. On this model, it's on the pons on down, but part of the side's broken away. That is medulla oblongata right there. I'll pick that up in a minute. We saw interthalamic adhesions. We went over the ventricles of the brain, and that, my friends, is all. I hope that helps. See you in class.